Columbia, and it is about ways in which teenagers choose to appropriate public open spaces in the Bay Area. And I started out with 3 questions. The first is, why do some teenagers use open spaces for purposes other than visiting uses? Do they intend to break formal and informal rules? And what can we learn from observing them in these spaces, and how can we apply this to design of more teenage-friendly spaces? So I started out with a literature review to kind of make the case for teenagers having a right to public space. And then I did a pilot study in New York spaces where I observed them using New York spaces. And then I took this methodology and moved it to the Bay Area, where I found 3 different places and visited them 3 times, did behavioral mapping, counted people and looked at behaviors, and then I interviewed these teenagers as they were using these spaces in their own comfort zone. So why does this subject matter? So from my own experience working in local government in New York, and also from reading, perceptions of teenagers are very negative. They're seen as a nuisance. If they're in the street, they're suddenly going to fall into a cycle of destruction and unprotected sex and drugs, and they're just going to get into a lot of trouble. So they shouldn't be in the streets. And they're disenfranchised from open space through both policy and design. And examples of policy are like curfew laws and regulations, which prohibit when teenagers can be outside, and anti-skateboarding regulations. And in open space, public space owners, the public, doesn't often want them in space, so they're designed against. And this is seen through privatization and through physical barriers put on the physical environment against skateboarding, for instance. However, even though they're not welcome, or they don't feel welcome in public space, teenagers do need, like every other social group, to feel like they belong in open space, like they have a space, that they're accepted, and they have different needs than do other age groups, which are conflicting sometimes with what other age groups want and needs. For instance, they hang out in larger groups, they like less specific structure in their environment, they need some freedom as well as structure in their environment. And they too have the right to open space. So my study area was the Bay Area in general. I'm not going to give you specific locations that I looked at, but this is the Bay Area. It consists of, in California, it consists of 9 different counties and has a population of about 7 million people. And income levels are very, very variable, and so are races throughout this. But overall, it's more affluent than the rest of the United States. So in this presentation, I'm only going to use drawings, and that is to preserve the anonymity both of the users and of the spaces themselves, because as I was behavioral mapping, I observed very many frowned upon activities taking place, and some illegal ones as well. So my first case study is a stairwell in an urban park, which is about 5 acres in size, in a gentrifying community, which this stairwell is also a bridge. It's sunken on one side. This is the map of it. It's sunken on one side, and on the other it is a lookout area. So you can, from here you can look out at the rest of the park, and from here you can hide. And I visited this space 3 times, counted 72 people, only 7 of which were adults who were using the site. And although this space is actually it's a transportation area, people walk through it all the time, it feels private. And many of the teenagers here were smoking weed, they were hanging out, and they were just hanging out, basically. So when I interviewed the teenagers, I found out that they actually feel like they really belong here. They enjoy the space. They come here to, as one girl said, look at the view and get high. And surprisingly, nobody really bothered them here. They had no reported issues with authority figures, and they felt like they were a community, like they belong, and they had, many of these kids, or teenagers, came here very, very often. So the second case study is a parking lot, which is right next to a high school in a suburban area that is very affluent. And at first I thought this would be a really whatever sort of place, not very interesting, but this area actually had really interesting social dynamics in it. It is just a basic parking lot. This is a convenience store. It has a small, very small platform in front of it, just concrete and a flat parking lot space. But as I observed this space and visited it, I noticed that different areas within the space are allocated for different uses. And on the right, teenagers would come and buy quick drinks, and they would put their drinks on the windowsill. There was no table or anything nearby, and they would just eat and leave. But on the left side, there were teenagers who would come here very, very frequently to smoke. And one time during lunch, I came here and I noticed one of the girls parked her car right here, opened the doors, and put on music and made it into a semi-private public space. And the teenagers who were hanging out there were very open with their body language and very expressive and obviously felt very comfortable. And when I interviewed, and smoking was very popular here as well, and when I interviewed teenagers in the space, there was very strong differing opinions depending on the group that was using the space. The teenagers who come here to smoke, I learned, were known as the cancer circle by their colleagues. And these teenagers came here all the time. I saw them all the time. And to them, this was their space. And authority figures, this is teachers and police people and parents, disapproved of them being here often. But the teenagers came here and everyone knew about it. And they intermingled. Other kids, teenagers who came to the space but weren't part of this group, often felt very mixed feelings about this group, and they didn't always approve of them and said that they were very sketchy and kind of strange and, should stay away from them. A lot of these teenagers felt that if their parents found out that they came and hung out in this parking lot, they would get in a lot of trouble. I asked one of the girls, this is a very good indicator of ownership, I asked her what would happen if we made this space better, if we added a table here. And she said to me, I don't care about the environment. If a table was added, it would get too crowded, like when everyone is standing. She felt ownership. She did not want other people coming in and taking over her spot. A lot of ownership here. The third spot I looked at was a plaza in an urban center. And here convenience was not a factor because it's in the middle of a financial district and it's very centrally located. But at any time of the day, except for in the mornings, you can find teenagers skateboarding here. And the interesting thing about this site is that it is in the middle of the pedestrian corridor, so there are always people crossing, like 50 at a time. But the teenagers use it to skateboard, and also to smoke weed and sometimes alcohol as well. And when older skateboarders were there, you can see that the teenagers actually would move to the other side of the plaza. They would go here, while the older ones would here. And they would use every single surface to skateboard. And they didn't mind anyone being there and watching them. And what I found when I interviewed them is that they really like being here, and that even though it's illegal to skateboard here, none of them had any idea. Well, one of them didn't have any idea that it was actually illegal to skateboard in this plaza. So they didn't see any sort of issues from authority figures. They weren't bothered. They felt like a community. When I actually approached them, they asked me, why didn't you approach us sooner? Because it's their space. It felt very private to them, and like I didn't belong there as an other. So overall, in all three spaces, except for the parking lot, there were more boys than girls using these sites, which was interesting. And teens use spaces in different ways than adults. Adults, they were often separated, adults were in smaller groups, and they didn't linger like the teenagers did. And in all three cases, the teenagers used these spaces in very creative ways. They found ways to make a mark on the space, like in the skateboard class, the teenagers wrote their names, they left their things behind while they were skateboarding because they trusted their colleagues to watch over their things. In the convenience store parking lot, there was the example of the car door and of the putting your drinks down. So another thing was the prevalence of antisocial activities, such as smoking weed, smoking cigarettes, skateboarding illegally, drinking, and all sorts of just loud behavior. But in all three cases, it's really surprising because the sense of belonging and ownership that these teenagers felt for their environment. It's their space, and they had appropriated it for their own uses. So last, I looked at implications for design and planning. And I think the biggest thing that we need to overcome as a society is that we need to overcome our social perceptions of adolescents as an age group and accept their needs as legitimate. And in turn, also accept appropriated uses of public open space, not just for teenagers, but also for other groups that might be marginalized. This is an example. These are examples of youth actually benefiting from fewer regulations. They felt like they belonged in the space, nobody bothered them, they could do whatever they wanted. And the way that this was designed, especially in the case of the parking lot and the plaza, this is a very big, flat, open space, which gives a lot of space, a lot of place to make it your own and to use it in whatever way you deem fit. And it also shows that maybe a way this process of including teenagers in the public planning process, if we do design charrettes and expect the teenagers to come to us, and we're only going to get a certain type of teenager. And many of these teenagers seem to feel marginalized, or they weren't, maybe, I don't know, I didn't ask them about their school backgrounds, anything like that, but they seem to be in some way disenfranchised. So maybe approaching them in their own spaces and coming to them as an equal in their own environment and asking them what they want might be a good way to interact with them. So that's it. Thank you.